cognition of God ought not to serve to change the use of our reason according to the order of nature and of morals, but to give it completeness, so that we connect the former with purposes and the latter with physical laws of the course of nature. Immanuel Kant. Kant distinguished philosophy into theoretical philosophy concerned with being, with what is, and practical philosophy concerned with duty, with what ought to be. There's also a bridge between the two, which is constituted by our concept of purposiveness. This does not form its own area of philosophy, but it connects the two areas, not fully belonging to one or the other. All of this I explained in more detail in my lecture on what is philosophy. Now, this aligns with Kant also saying that the human psyche has three faculties. The faculty of cognition, which obviously fits with theoretical philosophy. The faculty of feeling, pleasure and displeasure, which is connected with purposiveness, because if we find something purposive, it gives us a certain pleasure. This is where the pleasure, the aesthetical pleasure of the beautiful comes from to Kant. I explained that also in a previous lecture on the beautiful. And there's the faculty of desiring, which of course aligns with practical philosophy. And Kant's main works, his three critiques, deal with these three areas. There's the critique of pure reason. Then there is the critique of judgment, which deals in large parts with the aesthetical judgment about the beautiful, about the sublime, which give us pleasure, which are connected to our concept of purposiveness. And lastly, there is the critique of practical reason. All of these I have now discussed in my lectures on Kant, so you could think that I'm done discussing Kant's critical philosophy, but that is not the case. There is still the matter of his philosophy of religion missing, and that is what I want to get into now and what I want to spend my next lectures on. Because to Kant, all of philosophy deals with three questions. The question of what can I know? What should I do? And what may I hope for? And hope here can be understood in what may I believe in? Can I believe in a God? May I believe in a life after death? And so far, only the first two questions, what can I know? What should I do? Only they are answered. Unfortunately, Kant's philosophy of religion is not discussed as much, is not given as much attention as other parts of his philosophy. I mean, just look around, other videos here on YouTube claiming to explain Kant, to introduce his philosophy, or books for the wider public on Kant. They will probably deal in large parts with his transcendental idealism and how time and space to him are forms of viewing. Or they will deal with his categorical imperative, his whole theory of moral duty. But they might spend less time on his philosophy of religion. Case in point, the German Wikipedia article on Kant, I think the English one is a little better. The German article is terrible. But the point is that, of course, Wikipedia articles have these sub-chapters, and while the German article does have a chapter on Kant's theoretical philosophy and one on Kant's practical philosophy, there's then a very brief chapter that is titled something like Religion, History and Aufklärung, so enlightenment. As if these can just be summed up together, as if these topics are just an afterthought. And this, not paying more attention to Kant's philosophy of religion, does not do him justice. Whatever you think of it, it is an integral part of Kant's philosophy, and I go so far as to claim if you don't deal with Kant's philosophy of religion, if you don't understand this part of his thinking, you don't understand Kant. Because in a way, this is the highest point, this is the conclusion of his critical system. After all, Kant wants to help humans to cross between two cliffs and not to shipwreck on either. He is against what he calls Schwärmerei in German. He is against raving, against going beyond the boundaries of our reason, and against that he sets empiricism to protect natural science. But likewise, Kant is against skepticism that says there is only the empirical world. There is no way there is anything beyond the bounds of our reason. And against the skepticism, he sets his transcendental idealism to save religion. He wants to save both natural science and religion. And I would say that yes, while he has written these three critiques, his work, the religion within the bounds of mere reason, which he published a few years after his last critique, and which is one of his, if you go by sheer volume of text, one of his biggest works outside of the critiques, I would claim it could be called the unofficial fourth critique. And again, without this, one of the three questions that make philosophy, the question, what may I hope for, would remain unanswered. And therefore, philosophy as Kant understands it would remain incomplete. And Kant himself was very clear about the importance of religion and the philosophy of religion. Also, as I explained in my lecture, what is metaphysics to Kant, and metaphysics to him is the core of philosophy, he says that metaphysics deals mainly with three ideas: God, freedom, and immortality of the soul. And if you followed my Kant lectures till this point, the only one of these three ideas that has been proven so far is freedom. Freedom is a topic that Kant deals with in his practical philosophy. I myself gave a lecture what is freedom to Kant, and also a lecture on do we have a free will. But the other two, God and immortality of the soul, here the question, even after dealing with his theoretical philosophy, with his aesthetics and his practical philosophy, is still open. It only gets answered in his philosophy of religion. And to Kant, this always remained an important topic, even in his last years, and the notes he made in his last years that he did not get to turn into a proper book anymore. You still find plans of writing another book on the topic of religion, a book under the title Religion, the Highest Concern of the Human Being, considered in a speech of reason to itself, or in an address of reason to itself. So even till the very end, this remained an important topic to Kant. And so therefore, since I want to give an overview of Kant's whole philosophy, there's no way I can skip it. Of course, you could ask the question, why do others skip it? Why is it not given more attention if it was so important to Kant? And I think this has less to do with Kant himself and what his specific philosophy of religion is, and more with our age as a whole. because it's not like other philosophy of religion is giving much attention. Indeed, when I studied, of course, each university is a bit different and has different topics that maybe it spends more or less attention on. But at least when I studied here in Berlin, I don't remember there ever being any lecture or any seminar that was specifically about philosophy of religion. It was not given much attention, and it's probably not taken very seriously by the broader scholarly community. And I would say this is part of the zeitgeist, because what even is philosophy of religion? Well, philosophy, Kant would say, is a science of reason. When you do philosophy, you use your reason to think about something. So philosophy of religion would mean approaching religion with reason. And this most people don't want you to do. This most people don't think should or even could be done. And this is true both for the believers and the unbelievers, I find. When it comes to the believers, many don't like their religion questioned, or what they consider their religion. And questioning is what you do when you think about it with reason. Because I gave a lecture what reason is to Kant, and one way to define it is to say reason is the faculty of justification. And a conviction you hold is rational if you can justify it, if you can give reasons why you are convinced that this is true. An action you do is rational, as opposed to, let's say, an action that comes out of an instinct, or that is caused by an affection or whatever. An action you do is rational, again, if you can justify it, if you can give a reason why you did this action. So if we want to use reason to think about religion, the question is, can we justify our religion? Can we give a reason why we believe in God? And many believers don't want that. And this is not just true only for fundamentalists, for orthodox believers, no matter of which faith. No. Of course, those people would probably say it's blasphemy to use reason to question religion. It's blasphemy to ask for reasons, to ask for justifications. But I find that many liberal believers also don't want their faith questioned. Of course, they won't say you are going to hell for questioning it, but they are uncomfortable with it. They too want to simply blindly probably believe what they've been taught as kids even, and not think about this belief too much. Not think about truth, about whether this or whether any belief might be true. And I think that lots of the social peace and of the tolerance that we have achieved in our societies when it comes to matters of faith does not truly come out of Aufklärung, does not truly come out of people being rational and understanding maybe that their faith is following the same God as other faiths, even if maybe they do it in different ways. They're ultimately following one and the same God. But rather lots of this tolerance just comes from people not paying much mind to each other. People having sort of this silent agreement to just leave each other alone and to not ask for truth. But along with these believers, you of course have the unbelievers who also often won't be interested in philosophy of religion, because again, if this means thinking about religion with reason, then many atheists will say, well, there's nothing to think about. Religion simply is irrational, and that's all there is to say. So they will dismiss it right away, and with that, they will dismiss philosophy of religion. And they believe that actual Aufklärung means having no religion, right? Think of this enlightened atheist who thinks himself so enlightened, when really he's just entwilightened. He's not aufklärt, he's ausklärt, as I would say in German. And these people would simply say that wherever there is religion, there is no Aufklärung yet. Aufklärung is still needed there. And so the only conclusion you can come to if you think about religion with reason is that religion is nonsense. Now, I would always stress that the fundament of all Aufklärung is love for truth. And if that's the case, then surely we live in a very unaufklärt age. And nothing is more unaufklärt than lying to yourself about Aufklärung itself. Thinking, making yourself think that you're aufklärt when in truth you're not. And this is the case. This is what's happening. Nowadays, we are used to think of Aufklärung as something good, right? The age of Aufklärung, that was something good. And for that reason, we tell ourselves that everything we consider good nowadays, from democracy to atheism, has its root in the age of Aufklärung. So, and therefore they are aufklärt, these things. Therefore we, practicing these things, must also be aufklärt. Of course, that's very superficial, and that's very self-deceptive, because if you just tell yourself whatever you happen to think is good right now, at this present day, that is aufklärt, that comes from being aufklärt, then of course you will always come to the conclusion that you must be aufklärt, whatever you are doing. But the truth is that if we were to look at what Aufklärung actually meant in the age of Aufklärung, to those who actually were Aufklärers, then we would maybe find that there have been some historical ruptures, that we have changed direction, that we are not simply the children of Aufklärung, as much as that age, of course, does have an influence of us, on us, but rather that in many ways we are very unaufklärt nowadays. And when it comes to religion specifically, I mean, if you look at the age of Aufklärung, it's a simple fact that they were not against religion. All the great Aufklärers, be it Kant, be it Lessing, be it Fichte, they were all very religious. It is of course true that the Aufklärung was fighting against what it considered superstition, what it considered raving, and that it was fighting against the interconnection of church and state. But all of that was not, in the minds of these people, in their own minds, a fight against religion as such. Rather, it was a fight for religion. They wanted to aufklär religion, to purge it of the unaufklärt elements, of the prejudices, just as much as they wanted to aufklär science or morality or politics or art or whatever. I mean, just because they wanted to aufklär science and to get rid of prejudices in science, that also doesn't mean that they were anti-science, right? That means they were pro-science, in fact. But of course, it is common in history that people start something and then it takes on a sort of life of its own and turns into something they never meant to start. And then in retrospect, when people are looking back, they treat these people who started it as if they had wanted to start that very thing, which in the end it turned out to become, right? So nowadays people will treat Jesus as a Christian, or they will treat Luther as if he had wanted to start a new church or whatever. When, of course, Jesus was very much rooted in the Mosianism of his time, and the Israelitism of his time. And when, of course, Luther wanted, well, yeah, sure, Reformation, but you have to consider that reformation originally means not creating something new, but rather going back to the old form, right? Reform into what had been there before. And so dealing with Kant's philosophy of religion is not just important and interesting because it's part of Kant's individual philosophy and you get to understand Kant better, but rather you get to understand Aufklärung as a whole better. After all, Kant is maybe the most prominent Aufklärer there was. And if you compare what he wrote with what people like Lessing or like Fichte wrote, you will find that his philosophy of religion is not so much just his specific philosophy of religion, but rather a good example of the aufklärt philosophy of religion as such. And when you do deal with it, you will find that the Aufklärung and that Kant had very different views of religion in some ways than our current age does, and then what might be considered as aufklärt in our current age. So you may find the Aufklärung with its philosophy of religion very untimely if you deal with what Kant has to say about it. And in a time and age that is in the process of destroying the very fundament of its own life in the climate and ecological crisis, in a time and age that is built on exploitation and imperialism and genocide, something being untimely might be a compliment. It definitely isn't an attack when I say it. But anyways, you are hereby invited to get into Kant's philosophy of religion with me. Religion, whatever you think of it, whatever your opinion of it now, should still be considered an important topic that we should deal with philosophically. I mean, even if you're an atheist, you have to deal with the fact that most people do not consider themselves atheists, that you share this earth you live on with a lot of people who do believe in some fate and some sort of God or whatever. And whether you like it or not, you're forced to live together with them and to somehow get along with them on this planet. And so thinking critically, thinking rationally about religion, taking it seriously, which does not mean simply blindly believing, but taking it seriously as an object of philosophical inquiry, is something we all should do. Now, when it comes to Kant's philosophy of religion, the first important point is that he distinguishes very strictly between theology and religion. The former being theoretical, the latter being practical. Because by theology, in the narrow sense, Kant understands a certain science, namely the science that deals with God, right? That's what it means. Theos is God in Greek, and logy, just like in biology or geology or whatever, is the doctrine, the teaching of. So I already gave a lecture of what science means to Kant. To him, science is systematic cognition, while the non-scientific, the common cognition, is unsystematic, is rhapsodic. So if science is systematic cognition, then theology as a science means systematic cognition of God, of the highest being. However, Kant also uses the word theology in a less narrow and a broader sense, where not just the science, the systematic cognition of God, but even common opinions of God are called theology by him. So, in that sense, everyone has a theology according to Kant, because your theology is whatever you consider true when it comes to God. So, whatever opinions, whatever convictions you have regarding God, that is your theology. Including if you're an atheist, then your theology is that there is no God, but that is still a statement of truth about God. So, again, your theology is theoretical. It's your opinion on God. But religion to Kant is something practical. That is how you act towards God, or in regards to God, or in the face of God. Right? So religion is something you practice. Of course, your religion might very much be informed and influenced by your theology, right? Depending on what you think about God, you will probably act differently. But still, they are two different things. Kant would say you cannot call someone religious simply because he believes in God. If someone says there is a God, but then that has no influence on his actions whatsoever, and he lives his life as if there was no God at all, then that person does have a positive and affirmative theology, but he does not have any religion. And I mean, there are people nowadays who will say, for example, well, I don't believe that there's nothing out there, or that we are a complete coincidence. I believe there's probably some higher power in the universe, which is some sort of theology, albeit a very superficial one. But then they act as if they were atheists, right? This abstract belief in a higher power has no influence on their life. So these people are not religious. And Kant says there are quite a lot of people that have a theology. So they will claim to believe in God, and maybe they believe that Jesus is God's son, and so on and so on. But that have basically zero religion. They don't care in their daily lives to act according to what they believe of God. And if they have religion at all, then it only sort of activates, Kant says, when they are about to die, when suddenly they remember that maybe they should regret their bad deeds and pray for forgiveness or whatever, because suddenly they are afraid of hell. So that is to be distinguished, theology and religion. And I want to start talking about what Kant has to say about theology before later, some lectures down the line, getting into what he has to say about actual religion. For Kant, keeping the two apart is very important. For one, because otherwise you simply don't have clear concepts, and it creates a lot of confusion. But also out of very practical considerations. Because if you mix theology and religion, then that might lead to you believing that theology is an integral part of religion. meaning you will believe that having the right theology, in other words, having the right opinion about God, is part of having the right religion. So you will believe maybe that in order to have the right religion and therefore to get on God's good side, to get in heaven, you must be of the opinion that Jesus is God's son who died for our sins, or you must be of the opinion that Muhammad is God's prophet and that he's the last of all the prophets, or whatever. And that you will go to hell even if you are a good person, if you have not believed in these things. That, however, to Kant is completely wrong. Actual religion, therefore the question of heaven or hell, is about our actions, not about our beliefs. And someone might have wrong beliefs as regards God, but still do good deeds and still act in accordance with God's will. And someone like that should not be treated as a heretic. And Kant also says that large parts of theology are completely speculative. What exactly speculation means, I discussed in the lecture on metaphysics. What is metaphysics to Kant? For our purposes here, it's enough to say that speculation is using your reason alone, not using experience, not empirical cognition, but rather using your reason alone to think about certain questions, metaphysical questions like God. But speculation is also, when Kant uses it, the opposite of what is practical. So a speculative question to him is one where I can use my reason to think about what is true or what isn't, but ultimately for my life, for how I act, it makes no difference, right? Many questions in religion are like that. I mean, you may believe that Mary was a virgin when birthing Jesus. You may even believe that she somehow magically or miraculously stayed a virgin even afterwards, even though the Bible speaks of Jesus' siblings, but of course then there are theologians who will say, oh, they weren't his siblings by blood, they were Joseph's kids from a previous marriage or whatever. But be that as it may, you may believe that Mary was a virgin, or you may not believe it, but that will probably not change how you act in your daily life. So that's a merely speculative theological question. And Kant stresses that the pastors, the priests, should leave the regular people alone with such questions. That's not just Kant writing that in a book that nobody reads. You have to keep in mind that Kant was a university professor, a philosophy professor, in a time and age when the whole kingdom of Prussia basically just had 3 universities, in Halle, Frankfurt at the Oder, and Königsberg, where Kant talked, and where there were only really 3 subjects at university: medicine, jurisprudence or law, and theology. And philosophy was considered the lower faculty, where everyone passed through, did their magister, so their master's degree, before then getting into one of the other 3. So in other words, a large part of the future pastors of Prussia as young men would pass through Kant's teachings, through his lectures. And one thing he tried to stress is that when preaching to the common people, they should not they should not drag speculative theological questions into the church. I mean, sure, you can discuss all sorts of speculative questions about God. How does God's knowledge, how does that go together with our free will? If God already knows what I will do, and am I even free to do something else then? Because in that case, God would not have known. Or can God truly create something out of nothing? Or can he truly destroy something? Because that would go beyond the laws of physics, right? Where energy or matter can be transformed into a different state, but cannot altogether be created or destroyed within this universe. You can ask such questions, you can discuss such questions, Kant says, in academic circles, at the university, in books, but they must not be discussed in a sermon. Rather, the sermon should focus not so much on theology, but rather on religion. So the pastor should rather preach to people about how they should act, about loving their neighbor, loving even their enemies. And in the end, this will be what God cares about, whether people have loved their neighbor, not whether they have been right about him in all their speculative opinions. So it's important for me to stress, and I'm not saying this for the first time, it applies to other parts of Kant's philosophy as well. Kant, despite being, of course, a great intellectual and despite having this reputation of writing very difficult books in a very difficult language that the average person can't understand, really, in a way, he's the defender of the average person, of the uneducated person, of the non-intellectual, the non-scholar, of common sense, against the scholars, against the intellectuals. Kant always stresses that in that which matters most to humans and which determines their whole worth as people, which is their morality and their religion, in that they mustn't be dependent on experts, on scholars. It mustn't be the case that you first have to have studied philosophy or theology to come to the right conclusions when it comes to morality or religion, because then that would mean that most people are condemned to not know what they should do and to blindly follow the experts in, again, the most important questions of their life. No, Kant always stresses the common healthy human intellect can get just as far as the scholar's intellect, or rather the other way around, the scholar can go no further in these questions than the regular person. And just like in other areas as well, Kant's philosophy of religion is mostly negative. So drawing borders, showing us our limits, taking away wrong opinions and prejudices, rather than expanding our knowledge, rather than teaching us something new that the average person can't know without being as great a thinker as Kant or whatever. He largely wants to, you could say, dig free true religion, the right practice, and largely do away with all the theological baggage that just prevents us from acting right. However, this does not mean that Kant is completely against theology, or that he says theology has no use or shouldn't be. Rather, he does consider theology important. Again, in a negative sense. Because if you don't use your reason to think about God, if you don't develop a correct theology, a correct opinion of God, that does not make you a worse human being per se, and this does not determine your worth, and this will not make you a heretic in Kant's eyes who deserves hell. But it is dangerous, of course, because if you form wrong opinions on God, then this also might lead to wrong actions. This might lead to wrong religion. This might lead to superstition and to raving. And so, in order to not get there, in order to free yourself of prejudices, and in order to not end up committing bad, sinful acts, it is helpful to have a correct theology. It is helpful to think critically about God. Now, if theology is theoretical, if theology is my opinions about God, the question arises, where do I get my opinions, or dare I say my knowledge of God from? And there are two possible sources, which is why there are two kinds of theology, not just to Kant, but to his whole age. So in the 18th century, it was normal to distinguish these two kinds. There is revealed theology, and then there is rational theology. Revealed theology means that what I know or what I believe about God is based on God himself revealing himself somehow. Through visions, through miracles, through prophets, and God's original revelation might be written down in a holy book, like the Bible or like the Quran. And revealed theology then tries to deal with these revelations and to interpret them, to understand them. But it presupposes that these revelations exist, that God has revealed himself, and that you already believe in them. And this is what is usually meant nowadays when people will say theology. Like when you go and study theology at university, what you study is largely revealed theology of one phase or another, right? You will study Catholic theology or Protestant theology or whatever. And also in Kant's day, when there was the theological faculty at university, this faculty dealt with revealed theology. And in the 18th century, it was common to sometimes translate the word theology into German, to say Gottesgelehrtheit, which literally means God scholarship. And Kant says, if we go with this translation, then it only fits for revealed theology, not for rational theology. Because only when it comes to revealed theology can you be and must you be an actual scholar. Only here there's something that can be learned, that can be taught, right? Certain doctrines of your faith, of your church, how you are supposed to interpret a specific revelation. But also other things that by themselves might not be part of theology as such, but that must be learned in order to do revealed theology. Most of all, language, right? So you might have to study, depending on what faith you belong to and what your holy book is, but you might have to study Latin, or ancient Greek or Hebrew or Arabic or Sanskrit in order to do revealed theology, and so therefore you must indeed be a scholar, a learned man. On the other hand, you have rational theology. And rational theology means that you use your own reason to think about God. So the insights you arrive at don't come from God revealing himself, from someone having a vision, from some prophet telling you something about God, but rather from you yourself thinking about God. So I will say that Kant also considers this a sort of revelation. He says God reveals himself to us through our own reason, because after all, God gave us this reason. So if through this reason we can understand God somehow, then in a way that is God revealing himself. And so Kant distinguishes between outer or empirical revelation, that would be the miracles and visions and so on, and that would be what revealed theology deals with. And on the other hand, inner or rational revelation, that is what our own reason can understand. And in the 18th century and till today also still, it was also common to call this sort of theology natural theology. Natural in the sense that the revelations that revealed theology is based on, the miracles, the visions, they are supernatural, right? They are not part of nature. But our reason is part of nature, and so we don't need any supernatural occurrences here. Rather, we arrive at knowledge about God through natural means, namely through thinking. However, Kant, he does also sometimes use this name natural theology to refer to rational theology. But to him, natural theology also is the name of a specific part of rational theology that he distinguishes from other parts that he calls transcendental theology, and then both transcendental and natural theology together make rational theology. For that reason, and to avoid confusion, I will stick to the term rational theology. I will just point out that if you read Kant yourself, you might also, in some instances, come across him saying natural theology. But be that as it may, Kant would say that this theology, when done by professionals, so to say, does not belong with the faculty of theology, like revealed theology does, but rather it belongs with the faculty of philosophy. It is a part of metaphysics. And indeed, if you go back to my lecture, What is Metaphysics, to Kant, there I also explained what subfields metaphysics have according to him, like rational psychology, rational cosmology, and also rational theology. There you can understand the structure of metaphysics better. But to him, the point is that rational theology is the job of the philosopher, of the metaphysician. However, at the same time, he would also stress that unlike revealed theology, it must not be limited to experts. So you don't have to be a professional metaphysician to use your reason to think about God. Rather, once again, he is of the conviction that this matter, which concerns us all, there's no more important question really to Kant than the question for God, must be something that everyone can think about, and that mustn't require years of study before you can understand anything or form any conviction first. And Kant says, for example, it was not the will of Providence that the insights so necessary to our happiness should depend upon the sophistry of subtle inferences. On the contrary, Providence has directly transmitted these insights to our natural common sense. And, provided that it is not confused by false art, it does not fail to lead us directly to what is true and useful, insofar as we are in extreme need of it. In this, Kant sees himself as being in accordance with the Bible also, namely the Epistle to the Corinthians, where it is said that it is not the wisdom of the world or the wisdom according to the world that counts. Rather, it is what is foolish in the eyes of the world that God has lifted up. And likewise, Kant says, you don't need to be a scholar, you don't need to be wise in the ways of the world, even as a common person, so foolish in accordance to the world, you must be able to think about religion. To him, Aufklärung is all about maturing, about being able to leading yourself. And to him, the main point of Aufklärung is about religion. So it mustn't be that in religion of all things, which is so important, you would have to forever submit to the opinion of the experts and not be able to form your own. So these would be the two types of theology, revealed and rational theology. One being for the scholars of the theological faculty, the other being for the philosophers, for the metaphysicians, but in a way even for everyone. Now, of course, they don't completely overlap in their content. There are certain statements about God that you cannot possibly arrive at through reason. This does not necessarily mean they are wrong. This just means they go beyond our reason. So if at all, we could only know them through revelation, right? There is no rational way to prove that God chose one specific people, the Jewish people, and made a covenant with them. There's no way our reason can tell us that God himself became man and sacrificed himself for our sins, and that of all people that ever lived, it was the specific man, Jesus of Nazareth, who was God. There is no rational way to know that Muhammad was God's prophet. Rather, these things have to be revealed. On the other hand, there are questions about God, such as, is there God at all? That, of course, also can be answered through revelation, but they don't necessarily have to be. Rather, we can also try to answer them with our own reason. But here, of course, there arises the question, what is the relationship between these two types of theology? Well, on the one hand, there are the orthodox enemies of Aufklärung, of reason, of thinking for yourself. And those people would claim that through reason alone, you cannot know God. You have to believe, you have to blindly follow his revelation, whatever it might be. And there have been people even in the history of Christianity that went so far as to say, credo quia absurdum est. I believe because it is absurd. So not only can it not be proven through reason, but rather to reason it seems wrong. It is absurd that God is also man. It is absurd that God sacrificed his own son for our sins. It is absurd that God died and was risen again from the dead, and we also will rise from the dead. And precisely because it is absolute nonsense that no rational person would ever have dreamed up, precisely because of that, we believe. That is what this statement, credo quia absurdum est, implies. Now, there are degrees of this opinion. Some would say that there is a place for philosophy, for rational thinking about God, but revealed theology comes first, and philosophy comes second and has to serve it, right? There used to be this saying that philosophy is the servant, the serving maid of theology, meaning mostly revealed theology. Just like other sciences or subjects of scholarship might be servants of theology, right? Like philology, the study of language, might be done in the service of revealed theology, studying Greek or Hebrew in order to better understand the Bible. Of course, there will also be fundamentalists to this day who will not even accept philosophy and rational thinking as a servant, and who will just demand blind faith. Of course, they are faced with the problem that there are many of their kind that belong to different faith, right? And that all demand blind faith. So one person will tell you, no, you have to blindly believe in the Bible. You mustn't question it. You mustn't demand rational proof. And the next person will tell you, you must blindly believe in the Quran. You mustn't question it. You mustn't ask for rational proof. So you can only blindly believe in one thing, right? The thing is with this opinion that there is no place for rational theology, that you cannot know God through your reason, that it is arrogant maybe even to assume that your natural reason could ever reach so high. You need God's revelation. This is not just the opinion of the orthodox, of the fundamentalist believers. It is also the opinion of many atheists. Many atheists will also dismiss rational theology. They will also say, through reason you cannot prove God. So they will agree that if it was possible to know of God, it would have to happen through God revealing himself to us, through some visions, through prophets or whatever. It's just, of course, that as atheists, they don't believe this happened. They don't believe in the supposed revelations, but they might believe that if at all, God would have to be known through revelation. And as a side note, this is not the only case where I find that the fundamentalist believers and the fundamentalist unbelievers have basically the same opinion on religion. They agree on basically everything, except the one insignificant detail on whether they believe this God that they both are talking about, because they both have the same idea of God, whether this God exists or doesn't exist. But apart from this insignificant question, they basically agree. And this is not something so special or unusual. In our society, you often are presented with what people believe to be and want you to believe are opposites that are opposed to one another and that exclude one another, when in truth they have lots in common and probably come from the same root. The fundamentalist believers and the atheists, but also, as I pointed out in my lecture on what is freedom to Kant, many of today's leftists and rightists, who, for all their seeming contradiction, are both liberals, both believing in this unrestricted, blind freedom to follow your whims, to do whatever arbitrary thing comes to your mind and to not question yourself. Or take capitalism and communism, which are presented as alternatives when both are economies based on a lack, based on scarcity, not on abundance, and both therefore believe that you have to in some way act utilitarian. You have to in some way do what is useful. You mustn't waste anything. With all these seeming alternatives, there may be different branches, maybe different fruits, but growing on the same tree, coming out of the same root. And if you want to truly aufklären yourself, you must go deeper. You must not believe something to be an alternative, an opposition, simply because you're told. Rather, you have to ask, what principles are these opinions based on? Because reason, again, I explained that in my lecture, what is reason to Kant? Reason is the faculty of principles. So if you want to be rational, you have to learn to think in principles, to seek the principles behind certain positions, behind certain opinions. And then you might find that opinions that on the surface are very opposed to each other might indeed be based on the same principles at the end. That if you want a real opposition, not just an opposition in how the specific principle is applied, you must seek for a completely different principle. But anyways, this would be one side, saying if God can be known, he can only be known through revelation, not through our reason. On the other side, at least in Kant's day, in the 18th century, you also had fundamentalists of a misunderstood Aufklärung, who would completely dismiss all revelation, all faith in miracles and visions and prophets and holy books as unaufklärt superstition, and who would claim that you can know God only through reason. Now, while the former opinion still lives on to this day, there are still many people who would say you cannot know God through reason, only through revelation. The latter opinion, I would say, is less common nowadays, because if nowadays you are a fundamentalist of a misunderstood Aufklärung, you will not believe in God at all. Not even in a God that can be found and understood through rational theology. Rather, you will just be an atheist. So this opinion is more limited to Kant's day and was more of, I would say, a precursor of today's atheism, really. But anyways, this question, can we know God through revealed or through rational theology? This to Kant is what makes up the conflict between the philosophical and the theological faculties. I already gave a lecture about the conflict of faculties. They explained that this is a very important topic to Kant. He also published a book under that title, but the topic goes beyond that book, and Kant wrote in one way or another about that topic in several texts of his. As I already said, in his day, there was the lower faculty of philosophy, including not just philosophy in the closer and a more narrow sense, but basically all kinds of sciences, of scholarships. And you would pass through that and do your Magister Artium, your Master of Arts, and then usually would go into one of the three higher faculties and study medicine or law or theology, and then try to get a job with that. And to Kant, there's a fundamental difference between the philosophical faculty and the three higher faculties, and therefore there's a sort of almost inevitable conflict between them. And I advise you, if you want to understand Kant at all, to check out this particular lecture of mine, because it is my thesis that this conflict of faculties is a key to understanding Kant as a whole. That if you understand what to him makes the conflict between the philosophical and the other three faculties, you gain a better understanding of what is philosophy to him, but distinguishes philosophy to other kinds of scholarship, of learnedness, and therefore also what is his own philosophical project, what did Kant want. But that is what I discussed in that other lecture on the conflict of faculties. Here I just want to point out that here precisely we are dealing with one of the three conflicts, the conflict between philosophy and theology. Can we know God simply by thinking ourselves, without being taught, without having learned anything, without being scholars, simply by being rational and thinking about God rationally? Or can we know God only through revelation, which in a way is empirical, right? Is something that was experienced. Someone saw a miracle or had a vision, and now we have to study, we have to learn, we have to become experts, maybe study an ancient language in order to interpret that revelation. Well, in this conflict, as always, according to his sympathetic method, but that method is, I also gave a specific lecture on. According to his sympathetic method, Kant always takes a sort of middle position. He always believes that both sides have merit and that you should take what is true in both sides and try to combine it into a new third position. Kant does believe rational theology to be more important or more fundamental in a way. He does not completely dismiss revealed theology. He acknowledges that maybe there can be revelation of God, and that maybe there can even be, let's say, important information about God that has to be revealed to us because we cannot arrive at it through reason. Again, maybe God has to reveal that He sent His Son to die for our sins, or that He sent Muhammad to be His prophet or whatever. But Kant would say we always have to have a rational theology first as a fundament, and the revealed theology has to agree with it, has to be in accordance with it. Because the problem with revelation is, of course, how do you know that revelation is true? Right? Just because someone claims to be a prophet of God, maybe he's lying, or maybe he's not even lying consciously, but maybe he's just hallucinating or whatever. So you need some sort of criteria for knowing whether a revelation, a supposed revelation, is true or not. And that criteria can, of course, not come from the revelation itself, right? It would make no sense for a prophet to say, I'm speaking the word of God. Everything I say is true because it comes from God. And when you ask him, okay, but how do I know that this claim is true? He then answers, well, because everything I say is true, right? Because it comes from God. That would obviously be a circle. And as I already said, the fundamentalist faces the question that there are different revelations. So there are different people demanding blind faith from him in different revelations. So he has to pick one. I mean, to be sure, in actual life, people probably don't pick based on reason. They probably pick based on what they were raised with and never even question what they were taught. But rationally thinking, before, let's say, you believe in the Bible or the Quran or whatever, you would need a criteria outside the Bible or the Quran that lets you decide which one might be true. And here Kant says our reason forms an idea of God. And I already talked about this in my lecture on what is reason, where I explained that reason is the faculty of ideas and what ideas mean to Kant. I also talked about it in my lecture on the result of the critique of reason. I explained that to Kant, ideas are concepts of a maximum, of something absolute, like the concept of God, which for that very reason, being absolute, cannot possibly be experienced, because experience is always experience of something limited. However, they do serve an important regulative function, Kant says, because we can sort of use them for measuring what we experience and for seeing if it fits with our ideas or not, right? Like I have an idea of justice. I've never experienced, nor will I ever, a truly without limits just state. But any real state that exists and any real law that exists, I can compare to my idea of justice, and then I can see how close it comes to that idea, or if it is in contradiction with that idea. And that's how I can judge things to be just or unjust, right? If I didn't have this idea, then I could not judge the actual laws or actions or states I experience to be unjust when I have never even experienced anything more just. But I have thought of something more just. I have the idea of justice that I can compare them to. And likewise, Kant says, I have the idea of God that I cannot experience as such. And even if there was a revelation, it would never be a revelation of God in himself. Like, let's say I'm Moses and I'm seeing a burning bush that speaks to me. Okay, that might be quite amazing, but that's not God, that's a burning bush, which is still something limited and still something that might be explained in some other way. Like maybe I'm just hallucinating, or maybe it is a miracle but not caused by God, but by a higher spirit, by the devil or whatever. Or maybe it is caused by aliens that have advanced technology that to me seems miraculous. Whatever I experience must still be limited. A burning bush, no matter how miraculous, is still limited. God as the absolute, as the unlimited, cannot be experienced. But what I experience, I can compare with my idea of God, and I can ask, does it conform to that idea or does it contradict that idea? In the latter case, it can definitely not be from God. In the former case, it might be at least. So Kant would say even the fundamentalist, if he were to be rational for 1 second, would have to agree that you cannot just utterly dismiss reason when it comes to God and just say you must blindly believe the revelation, the prophet, whatever. Because even the fundamentalist probably won't believe just anyone who claims to have a revelation from God, right? Go to the most fundamentalist synagogue or church or mosque or temple or whatever, walk in there and tell those people, hey, I'm a prophet, God just spoke to me and he dismissed everything you do, and here's the new face you have to follow from now on. See how well that goes. But if those people will not believe you simply because you claim to be a prophet, then through that, they, whether they like it or not, implicitly agree that the mere claim to have a revelation is not enough. That revelation somehow must be tested and scrutinized and criticized, and must be compared to the idea we have of God a priori, so previous to the revelation. So if, let's say, somebody tells a self-proclaimed prophet, well, if you come from God, then prove it through a miracle, then clearly that person already has the idea of God being omnipotent and therefore able to cause miracles that go beyond the laws of nature, and therefore that person believes that if the supposed prophet does something miraculous, that would prove him coming from God. Well, likewise, if you tell the supposed prophet, well, you claim to be from God, but you just did something evil or unjust, if you were from God, you would be righteous and holy and virtuous, then again, you must already have an idea of God as being holy, and therefore only picking a holy person as his prophet. And therefore, if you meet someone who's perfectly holy and always good, then you might believe or be willing to believe that he comes from God. But if you meet someone who has lots of vices and does evil things, then you're not willing to believe that this person comes from God. So, and this, by the way, just as a side note, this, for example, demanding miracles, this seems to be how the old Arabs approached Muhammad, right? They seem to have believed that if you indeed come from God, if you indeed are a prophet, you would have to perform miracles. So they must have already had a certain idea of God and try to compare Muhammad and his claims to that idea. That's what apparently happened if you read certain passages of the Quran. Like, now they swear by God with their most solemn oath that if a miracle were shown to them, they would indeed believe in this divine writ. Say, miracles are in the power of God alone, and for all you know, even if one should be shown to them, they would not believe. Kant, by the way, says to such an attitude, also, of course, he doesn't have in mind Muhammad so much as Jesus, that what should be enough for you if a supposed prophet speaks to you and tells you what God supposedly wants from you and tells you to be a good person, tells you to love your neighbor, what should be enough for you to believe is that that person himself is holy in his deeds, in how he lives his life. If on top of that holiness you also demand a proof of power through miracles, Kant says, well, that power, that raw power as such is not moral. It's morally neutral, right? The devil too can show power, or again, aliens with advanced technology could show power. So this does not prove anything. And Kant says, if on top of the prophet acting holy, you also demand him to first show off power, so you demand an immoral or at least non-moral proof on top of the moral one, then that already shows a despicable moral unbelief, Kant says. And in this too, I think he's quite in line with the Quran, which of course he himself could not be aware of. He hadn't read the Quran. But the Quran says, and yet they say, why have no miraculous signs ever been bestowed upon him from on high by his sustainer? Say, miracles are in the power of God alone, and as for me, I am but a plain warner. Why is it not enough for them that we have bestowed this divine writ on thee from on high, to be conveyed by thee to them? For verily, in it is manifested our grace, and a reminder to people who believe. Say unto those who will not believe, God is witness enough between me and you. He knows all that is in the heavens and on earth. And they who are bent on believing in what is false and vain, and thus on denying God, it is they who shall be the losers. But back to Kant. So he does say rational theology is possible and even necessary, and revelation must be based on it. Revelation itself must be scrutinized through reason. However, he does not dismiss revelation altogether. He does say maybe there can be revelation by God. Again, maybe God can reveal to us some, let's say, extra knowledge that our reason could never reach. But not only that, Kant also says it is possible, hypothetically, abstractly, to think about God without ever having received revelation. But if we look at it historically, we see that revelation came first. Because Kant says the ancient Greeks and Romans, with all their philosophy, with all their rationality, never formed a correct theology, never truly talked about God in the right way. There first had to be revealed religion. There first had to be Christendom, and then that could sort of point reason in the right direction, so that then people started using their reason to think about this religion. So Kant says when there is a revelation, it has to be questioned with reason, and it has to be able to withstand this questioning of reason. But still, that revelation might be needed to first wake our reason to the question of religion. Reason on its own, for the most part, would probably never start thinking about this. To make clear what Kant means here, you can maybe think about other rational truths, like think of mathematic truths. We all learned the Pythagorean theorem in school, so we learned it from our math teacher. That, in a way, is a revelation, right? The teacher just tells us what is true. Now, this theorem of Pythagoras can be derived at through mere reason. We don't need a math teacher to tell us that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We could come to this insight ourselves. Indeed, someone, probably not Pythagoras, the theorem was known way earlier than he lived, but someone didn't learn it from the math teacher, but rather had to have come up with it himself. But 99% of human beings would never have used their reason to think about triangles, and would never through their reason have come to understand and to find the Pythagorean theorem if it had not been, so to say, revealed to them by their math teacher. So historically, for most of us, this, let's say, revelation came first. Still, however, after it was taught to us, we of course have the task to think about it with our own reason and to understand it with our own reason. And only through that can we even be sure that our math teacher taught us correct mathematics, while otherwise we would just be blindly following him and blindly believing him. And to be sure, that's exactly what most students do. I would claim that most people never truly understand the Pythagorean theorem or other people they learn in math class. They just blindly repeat what the teacher says. And if the teacher had said not that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but rather that a squared plus b squared equals c, not squared, then they would have repeated that without questioning. But actually, I find that fits with the analogy very well, because that's also how most people treat religion, how most people treat their revelation. They just believe in it blindly, and not only would they not have used their reason without the revelation pointing them towards God to ever think about God, but also with the revelation, they still don't use their reason to ever question that revelation and whether it really holds up. But that, according to Kant, is what we should do. And for that reason, in my next lecture, I want to talk about what more specifically is rational theology, how does it work according to Kant, how can we use our reason to think about God. And then in the next few lectures, I want to get further into rational theology and its different parts. However, I will also at a later point talk about what Kant has to say about revealed theology, how we can try to make sure whether a revelation is true or not, and how we should interpret a revelation correctly. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenku Bilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Ellen Hansen, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.